When you move on peacefully, something quiet happens. Not outside of you, inside. Your mind stops reaching. Your emotions stop negotiating. And without a single word, the dynamic shifts. You don't feel lighter because she's gone. You feel lighter because your center comes back to you. This is where most men misunderstand power. They think strength is reaction, distance, silence, disappearance. But what actually changes things is emotional finality without resentment. No tension, no proving, no need to be seen. And here's the part few talk about. When your nervous system settles, people around you feel it, especially women. Not because you did something to them, but because you stopped orbiting anything outside yourself. If this message resonates, take a moment to like it, subscribe, or leave a comment. Not for validation, but so this perspective reaches other men who are done being reactive and ready to be grounded. Because in this video, you'll understand why peaceful detachment carries weight, how it rewires perception, and what actually happens when a man becomes emotionally self-contained. Stay with me. The real principle, the one that changes how you see yourself, women, and power itself, comes next. You remember the moment the shift began, not as a dramatic event or emotional confrontation, but as a subtle internal quiet that arrived without announcement, settling into you on an ordinary morning when you realized your body no longer carried the familiar tension that once pulled your attention outward in search of meaning, reassurance, or resolution. You wake and notice that the habitual impulse to check, replay, and reinterpret the past does not arrive on schedule. And as your phone remains untouched and your thoughts remain unprovoked, it becomes clear that something fundamental has disengaged, not through force, but through completion. As you move through the early hours of the day, your body operates without commentary, free from the internal tribunal that once argued over what should have been said, what might still be fixed, or what meaning must be extracted for you to feel intact again. And in that absence of negotiation, movement becomes clean, direct, and strangely unburdened. This is not emotional shutdown, nor is it the numbness that follows exhaustion, but rather the quiet authority that emerges when desire finally stops bargaining with uncertainty and fear, allowing you to occupy your own internal space without interference. Your pace changes without intention, slowing not from hesitation but from the absence of urgency, as your attention returns to physical reality in a way that feels grounded rather than distracted, aware of weight, breath, and rhythm instead of imagined outcomes or unresolved narratives. Men often mistake this state for emptiness because it lacks drama, but in truth, it is fullness without noise, a form of internal completion that does not require external acknowledgement to sustain itself. Later, when you enter spaces once charged with expectation, nothing about your appearance or behavior announces a transformation, yet the atmosphere adjusts regardless. As conversations subtly recalibrate around your presence, voices soften, and eyes linger just long enough to sense that something has reorganized itself beneath the surface. You are not projecting confidence, nor are you attempting restraint, because presence now arises naturally from alignment rather than effort, and this difference is felt before it is understood. There was a time when your emotional center leaned outward, oriented toward response and reciprocity, when your silence still carried questions, and your words sought resonance, not because you lacked strength, but because your identity had not yet reclaimed its internal axis. Now that axis has returned, not as a defensive posture or hardened boundary, but as a quiet closure, like a door that no longer needs to be guarded, because nothing inside it depends on who stands outside. This is where the dynamic shifts in ways that cannot be forced or imitated, because she notices not your absence, but the disappearance of emotional gravity that once kept your attention subtly tethered to her perception, leaving no tension to resolve, no emotional role to inhabit, and no signal to respond to. Distance without resentment carries a different texture, one that does not provoke defense or validation seeking, but instead invites reflection, because the mind struggles to interpret calm detachment that does not ask to be understood. As time passes without being measured, your energy consolidates around pursuits that return value cleanly strengthening your body, sharpening your focus, and reinforcing a discipline that does not depend on emotional exchange to feel meaningful while your reactions slow and your inner narrative stabilizes into something coherent and complete. You do not explain boundaries or assert them verbally, because your behavior has already embodied them, and this embodiment carries more weight than any declaration ever could. What once appeared as loss begins to register as depth, and what once felt like distance reveals itself as self-possession, as you become increasingly unreadable not through concealment, but through the absence of unresolved longing or resentment that others could once interpret. The shift unsettles the old dynamic quietly, as the absence of emotional access creates a vacuum that cannot be filled with explanation or reaction, only with reconsideration. Yet by the time this occurs, it no longer defines you. You sense the change indirectly, in tonal adjustments, in altered pacing, in the way interactions recalibrate themselves around your calm. But your center has already returned home, no longer requiring confirmation to remain intact. In this stillness, you begin to understand why composure has always carried more authority than intensity, why restraint communicates more power than explanation, and why the most significant shifts in perception occur not through action, but through internal closure. This is not strategy or performance, but structure, the natural outcome of a man whose internal hierarchy has reordered itself correctly. And as the day closes, you realize that the most consequential effect of moving on peacefully is not that others notice, but that you do, recognizing how little is required to remain whole, how few answers are necessary to move forward, and how power once reclaimed internally ceases to seek permission to exist. What follows, the curiosity, the recalibration, the subtle return of attention, unfolds independently of your concern, because the real transformation has already taken place. And in the next part, you will see precisely why this internal closure does more than change relationships, as it begins to alter the way the world itself positions you within it. What begins to change next is not visible on the surface, because the most consequential shifts never announce themselves through behavior, posture, or words, but through the subtle reordering of how reality responds once your internal hierarchy no longer leaks urgency or unresolved need. You start to notice that situations which once demanded explanation now resolve themselves without effort, not because people suddenly became more reasonable, but because your presence no longer invites negotiation, justification, or emotional bargaining, leaving others to orient themselves around a calm that cannot be pulled off center. This is where power becomes misunderstood again, because most men believe influence comes from assertion or withdrawal, when in reality it emerges from the absence of internal friction, from the way certainty expresses itself quietly when nothing inside you is asking to be corrected or completed. As you move through interactions, you feel less compelled to define yourself, clarify intentions, or manage perception, because the need to be interpreted has faded, replaced by a steadiness that allows others to project, recalibrate, and reassess without resistance, which paradoxically increases your psychological weight. Women are especially sensitive to this shift, not because they are consciously analyzing your behavior, but because their perception is attuned to emotional alignment and internal consistency, detecting when a man's sense of self is no longer contingent on external validation or relational outcome. Before, your attention carried a direction, even in silence, signaling availability, expectation, or emotional openness. But now that direction has collapsed inward, forming a closed circuit that feels complete in itself, leaving no open loop for interpretation or response. This creates a strange psychological effect, because when access disappears without conflict, the mind searches for explanation, replaying past interactions not to regain control, but to understand what moved, what settled, and what no longer responds to familiar cues. You do not witness this process directly, because you are no longer inside the dynamic, but its effects ripple outward anyway, reshaping distance, curiosity, and tone, not through manipulation, but through absence of emotional leverage. What once bonded through intensity now dissolves through calm, revealing how much of attraction was never about connection, but about tension, anticipation, and the need to resolve uncertainty, all of which evaporate when your inner state stabilizes. This is why peaceful detachment feels heavier than anger or withdrawal, because it leaves nothing to push against, no friction to generate reaction, no emotional edge to sharpen interest through resistance, forcing perception to confront stillness instead. As your days continue, you realize that discipline has changed shape, no longer functioning as restraint against impulse, but as alignment with your own rhythm, where effort is directed cleanly and attention rests where it produces clarity rather than noise. You begin choosing silence not as avoidance, but as preference, recognizing that words carry more weight when they are not required to secure position or soothe uncertainty, and that presence communicates more than explanation ever could. In this state, respect stops feeling like something earned through performance and starts feeling like a natural response to coherence, because people instinctively trust what appears internally resolved, even when they cannot articulate why. The old patterns weaken further as attempts to re-engage the familiar dynamic fail to land, not because you resist them, but because they no longer connect to anything inside you that needs to respond, creating a subtle but unmistakable shift in balance. You notice how often emotional chaos was mistaken for depth, how volatility was confused with passion, and how calm was misread as indifference, when in truth calm is simply the absence of internal contradiction. This realization does not make you superior or detached from others, but more precise, more selective with your energy, more aware of how easily men give away authority by reacting to what does not require response. And somewhere in this precision, you recognize that attraction was never something to be generated, but something that surfaced naturally when emotional structure replaced emotional pursuit, when self-command became visible through restraint rather than effort. What unsettles others now is not mystery, but finality, the sense that your emotional position no longer shifts in response to pressure, persuasion, or distance, removing the possibility of leverage entirely. This is not cruelty, nor is it withdrawal, but completion, the state in which you are present without being accessible, open without being influenced, grounded without being immovable. As this stabilizes, the world begins to meet you differently, not because you demand it, but because people adjust instinctively to what cannot be pulled into reaction, orbiting calm the way noise eventually reorganizes itself around silence. You see clearly now that power was never about controlling outcomes or perceptions, but about controlling your internal orientation so completely that outcomes lose the ability to destabilize you. And this understanding prepares you for the final shift, the one most men never reach, because it requires releasing even the satisfaction of being noticed, allowing influence to operate without acknowledgement. In the final part, you will see how this internal sovereignty reshapes not only attraction and respect, but identity itself, revealing why men who master this state no longer seek power, because power begins moving toward them instead. At some point, you realize that the final transformation does not arrive as confidence, clarity, or even peace, but as a profound reduction in inner noise, a thinning of the internal dialogue that once demanded meaning, response, or emotional resolution from every interaction that crossed your path. You notice that situations which once would have stirred curiosity, hope, or irritation now pass through you without disturbance. Not because you have become indifferent to life, but because your sense of self no longer requires external confirmation to remain intact, allowing you to experience events without being reorganized by them. This is where identity quietly settles into place, no longer shaped by reaction or opposition, but by continuity, as you begin to feel the same internal posture whether you are alone or observed, praised or ignored, desired or forgotten. And that consistency becomes the source of a gravity that cannot be summoned on command. What changes most is your relationship with anticipation, because you stop leaning forward into imagined outcomes and begin inhabiting the present moment with a completeness that leaves no emotional residue behind. And this presence carries a subtle authority that others feel before they understand it. You recognize now that many of the behaviors once mistaken for strength were simply expressions of unrest, efforts to manage perception or secure position in a world that felt uncertain. And that true power required neither tension nor display, only internal alignment sustained over time. Women sense this not as a signal to respond, but as a condition to respect, because emotional sovereignty alters the field in which attraction operates, shifting it from pursuit and reaction into something quieter, rarer, and less predictable, where interest emerges without being invited. Yet even this awareness loosens its grip on you, because the need to be seen, felt, or acknowledged has dissolved, replaced by a deeper satisfaction that comes from knowing your internal state no longer bends around another's behavior, approval, or absence. You move through life now with fewer explanations and less urgency, allowing silence to do the work words once attempted, trusting that what is stable does not need reinforcement, and that what is grounded does not need defense. This is the point where many men stop mistaking composure for the end of the journey, but you sense there is something beyond even this, a final release that comes from abandoning the subtle pride of being unshaken, and simply existing without comparison, measurement, or internal commentary. In that release, influence becomes invisible, operating without intention, as people adjust instinctively around a man who is no longer negotiating his place in the world, who neither resists nor pursues, and whose presence carries the quiet certainty of someone who has already arrived. You understand now that peaceful moving on was never about leaving someone behind, but about returning fully to yourself, closing the loop that once scattered your energy outward, and reclaiming the authority that only emerges when nothing inside you is unresolved. And with that understanding comes the final truth, the one that reframes everything that came before, as you realize that the most powerful men are not those who command attention, but those who no longer require it, because the world responds differently to a man who is complete. This is where the journey ends, not with triumph or validation, but with stillness, as you step forward without carrying the weight of what was, fully present, internally ordered, and untouched by the need to be noticed. And from this place, whatever comes next is no longer something you seek, but something that finds you.